after passing through a sizable flock of birds on November 10, 2008. A Reiner Boeing 737 carrying 172 passengers and crew members finally approached the Ciampino Airport in Italy. When both engines failed, the crew attempted to turn around, but lost control. Halfway down the runway, the aircraft made a crash landing, resulting in significant damage and multiple passenger injuries. What made the skipper choose to circle around? Was it required to use force to land? What steps may be taken to avoid such occurrences in the future? Keep watching to find out. On November 10, 2008, early in the morning, Reiner Flight 4102 took off from Frankfurt, Germany. It took 1 hour and 50 minutes to reach its destination, the Ciampino Airport in Italy. The aircraft, a contemporary Boeing 737-800 with an exceptional safety record, was 8 months old. At the time, Reiner had a sizable 737 fleet and had flown them for over 10 years without experiencing any major incidents. There were 2 people working as the flight crew. The 44-year-old Belgian national pilot had about 10,000 hours of flying experience, 6,000 of which were spent aboard the 737. This flight's first officer had significantly less experience. At the time, he was a 23-year-old Dutch national who had worked for Reiner for just 6 months. Only 600 flight hours had been accrued, 400 of which were in the 737. At 7:20 a.m. local time, the pilots started their descent into Ciampino, following a perfectly ordinary flight south. The captain was informed by the first officer on the alignment corporate procedures approach. The first officer described the go-around technique with confidence, and the captain remarked that the weather was perfect for flying. Knowing that the first officer was a novice pilot, the captain gave him the opportunity to operate the aircraft by hand for the remainder of the journey as they plummeted through 17,000 feet. The captain thought it was crucial that inexperienced pilots gained hands-on experience flying manually. As the airplane aligned with a runway for final approach, everything happened without a hitch. The tower informed the pilots that the skies were clear and the wind was calm, allowing the aircraft to land. The captain instructed the first officer to make a few small adjustments to his approach path during final approach. Throughout final approach, the captain kept giving the first officer feedback to make sure the conditions for a steady approach were met. When the aircraft's computer-generated voice signaled minimum, meaning that it was time to decide whether to circle. The first officer and the captain both said that they were proceeding with the landing. The skipper saw a group of birds in front of the plane just before landing. The flock resembled a black cloud that appeared from below, according to the first officer's later description. The aircraft was about to pass the runway threshold at a height of slightly over 100 feet when the captain gave the command to go around, triggering the engine's takeoff go-around mode. The flaps were lifted from 40 degrees to 10 degrees, and the throttles were fully forward. But there was no evading the birds, and the aircraft hit with them barely above the runway at the precise moment that full force was applied. But the engines began to slow down rather than provide the necessary push to move forward. Consequently, the airplane was unable to ascend. The pilots decided to forego raising the landing gear and the other items on the go-around checklist as a result. As soon as possible, however, the captain assumed command of the airplane and focused solely on scanning the exterior to guide it to the safest possible runway landing. The jet stalled and dropped quickly toward the runway below. Even though the captain had the nose of the aircraft raised, the plane descended at a speed of roughly 1,000 feet per minute and struck the ground at a point halfway down the runway at 120 knots. The main left landing gear and the rear fuselage of the airplane touched down first. The main landing gear on the right then touched down. The left engine then made contact with the runway as the left-hand landing gear collapsed. During the ground roll, the pilots employed the spoilers, left engine thrust, and brakes to reduce the speed of the aircraft. Situated about 50 meters from the runway's end, the airplane came to a stop. In under 15 seconds later, pilots deactivated the engines. A few of the passengers had minor injuries, but they were all evacuated. The airplane was written down due to significant damage. The photos, which were shot not long after, demonstrated how serious the collision was. The Italian Civil Aviation Safety Investigation Authority promptly began an investigation following the tragedy. Nobody was surprised to learn that the primary cause of the disaster was impact with a thick flock of birds during final approach, as confirmed by an examination of the aircraft following the crash landing and interviews with the pilots. 86 impacts in all were tallied. Still, it was unclear if the result really had to be as horrible as it had been. The fact that the birds were dead was found by the investigators only 7 or 8 seconds before the jet would have landed. There was an attack. They decided that it would have been safer to carry out the landing, in this case, regardless of the extent of the aircraft damage. They found that the pilot's attempt to go around at the moment of the bird impact had resulted in an increase in thrust, which had actually caused the majority of the damage to the engines. They came to the conclusion that had the pilots persisted in their approach, it is most likely that the damage to the engines would have been limited to the fan blades located at the front of the engine without reaching the engine's core. This would have made it possible for the plane to land normally and safely. The pilot's go-around further damaged the engines by using a high power setting, which prevented them from producing thrust. This caused the plane to slow down to the point of an aerodynamic stall, which is why the crash was so violent and destructive. The plane crashed at the halfway point of the runway. Why had the captain chosen to circle around was the primary question on investigators' minds. After all, the plane hit the birds just seconds before it was supposed to land down. The captain provided several explanations for why he thought a go-around was the best course of action during conversations with investigators. He began by pointing out that the aircraft weighed more than 61 tons, which would raise the runway's stopping distance requirement. Furthermore, the stopping distance might have been further exacerbated by the bird's damage to the brakes and undercarriage. At last, there was a tailwind, and the Ciampino runway was shorter than typical 737 runways. If the crew had completed the approach, there was a higher chance that they would have overshot the runway because of all of these reasons. The captain explained that a go-around would allow them time to evaluate the situation and maybe make an approach to an airport with a longer runway, such as Fiumicino Airport, which he knew was nearby. Above all, the captain stated that there was uncertainty about the landing's safety at the time of the bird attack, and that, to paraphrase, we were educated to proceed around in case of doubt. Several pieces of evidence suggest that the captain's actions were motivated by the startle effect. He first yelled, I, 10 times fast after seeing the birds. As you may expect, this is not your typical call-out. Second, instead of using the standard 15 degrees for go-arounds, the captain changed the flap setting from 40 degrees, which was the landing setting, to 10 degrees when the go-around maneuver was commenced. Investigators discovered that the skipper had not intended to choose 10-degree flaps during questioning and was ignorant of having chosen this option. This fits the description of the startle effect. That is, an automatic response to something unexpected, such seeing a large flock of birds in front of you. Investigators explained this response in the official accident report, citing the lack of instruction the flight crew had received on what to respond in the event of a bird strike during landing. They also came to the conclusion that this accident was partly caused by a lack of instruction on how to handle the startle effect during crucial moments of combat. Boeing added a section on bird strikes to the 737 pilot training manual during this occurrence. This passage, "Crew actions for a bird strike during a poacher landing," is taken from that section. The best course of action is to keep approaching the landing if the landing is certain. If you come across other birds, pass through the group and land. Keep the thrust setting as low as you can. Reverse thrust should only be used during landing to the extent necessary to stop on the runway if engine ingestion is suspected. In reaction to this incident, Ryanair modified their simulator training as well. And in reaction to comparable low-altitude mishaps that occurred at the time, including as the 2008 British Airways 777 short final at London Heathrow and the Hudson River ditching of US OWE Flight 1549. This training comprised 3 simulated settings, and in order to maximize the startle effect and mimic real-world conditions, pilots received very little prior information about the events. These were the situations that were presented. On final approach, a bird hit at 700 feet caused a twin-engine failure. After hitting a bird at 6,000 feet before takeoff, the aircraft was able to return to the airfield and do a glide approach. A bird hit that occurred while departing at 3,000 feet required a ditching in the RHC. The accident's final report suggested that the pilots be given instructions and training methods on how to handle bird attacks during final approach. It was suggested that the guidelines address the following subjects: to talk about the dangers of bird strikes during takeoff and approach briefings while working at airports where bird activity is known or predicted. If landing is certain, following 1 or more bird hits during the final approach phase, it is better to land while retaining the lowest engine power level rather than doing a go-around process. Lastly, keep in mind that an engine failure or damage could make it hard to finish the go-round maneuver safely, which would preclude landing on the runway in the event that one is attempted. Additionally, the paper suggested that pilots receive specialized training to assist them deal with the startle effect, especially during crucial flight phases like approach and landing. Thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on our future content. Until next time, stay curious, stay creative, and keep exploring.